In January of 1965, two 15-year-old girls, Marianne Schmidt and Christine Sharrock, took four of Marianne's young siblings to the beach. The four children returned home at 8 p.m. that night without their sister and her friend. What started out as a fun outing turned into one of the most famous unsolved murder cases in Australian history after the teens had an encounter with a monster. Marianne Schmidt was born on October 30th, 1949 in Bavaria, West Germany. Her family immigrated to Australia in 1957, and they lived in Temora, a town about 400 kilometers or 250 miles inland from the eastern coast of New South Wales. Marianne was known to be well-behaved and a good student. Her mother would say she wasn't overly social, but did enjoy going to the beach with her siblings. Eventually, the family moved to Sydney, and Marianne's father, Helmut, was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease in 1963. He passed away the following year, and the family scraped by on her mother Elizabeth's widow's pension. Marianne's older brother, Helmut Jr., worked as an apprentice electrician for New South Wales Government Railways. They lived in a small house in the West Ryde suburb, and Marianne attended Marston High School. After moving there, Marianne met Christine, who was almost exactly the same age and lived next door. Christine Sharrock was born on October 5th, 1949 in New South Wales. Another thing the two girls had in common was that they both had lost their fathers, with Christine's father Cecil having passed away in 1953, though the cause of death is unclear. After that, her mother Beryl remarried and had another child with her new husband. Christine never felt like she was part of that family, and she opted to move in with her grandparents Jim and Jeanette Tagg. Their house was next door to the Schmidt's house on Brush Road in West Ryde, which was in northern Sydney, not really close to Wanda Beach. Christine was the only child in her home, and that was contrasted by the 7 children that lived next door. Marianne had 6 siblings, her only older sibling 16-year-old Helmut. Then there was 13-year-old Hans, 10-year-old Peter, 9-year-old Trixie, 7-year-old Wolfgang, and 5-year-old Norbert. On January 9, 1965, Marianne's mother Elizabeth was in the hospital recovering from surgery, and Marianne had been put in charge of the younger siblings. While at the hospital visiting her mother, Marianne asked if she could take the children to the beach the following day. The only beach they had been to was the beach in Cronulla, so Elizabeth assumed that was where they were going. Cronulla is a southern suburb of Sydney that sits on Bait Bay and is home to a number of beaches. Cronulla Beach, Allura Beach, Shelley Beach, and the now infamous Wanda Beach. Elizabeth agreed, but the next day it rained, so the trip was postponed. On the 11th, Marianne got up and prepared some Marmite sandwiches for lunch before heading out of the house with 4 children: Peter, Trixie, Wolfgang, and Norbert. Hans decided to stay home with Helmut. They met up with Christine, who had brought some flavored syrup to add to the thermos full of water that Marianne had packed. They walked down the street to catch a bus to the West Ryde rail station, but it never showed up, so they ended up walking the whole way. They took the train to Redfern, where they changed to a train to Cronulla. The journey took about 2.5 hours, and they arrived at the beach a little after 11 a.m. to find it closed due to strong winds causing dangerous waves. They hung out on some rocks for a little while, and then Marianne found a shallow area of water away from the rocks so Wolfgang could play in the water a little bit. Then they ate sandwiches and decided to walk up to the sand hills at Wanda Beach. They hid their belongings in the rocks and they started walking north. On their way, the young kids continued complaining about the wind, so Marianne said she would go back to the rocks and retrieve their belongings so they could go home. She and Christine had the 4 kids sit behind a sand hill with a transistor radio for company, and they walked away. But instead of going south toward the rocks, they continued walking north. Peter yelled out that they were going the wrong way, but the girls just giggled and continued walking toward Wanda Beach. The children never saw Marianne or Christine again. They sat in that spot making sand castles and listening to the radio until 5 p.m. before they finally decided to try to go home themselves. They walked back to the rocks where they found their belongings exactly how they'd left them. Their return train tickets and the girls' money was still there. They walked back to Cronulla and took the last train back at 6 p.m. and arrived home at about 8 p.m. By the time they got home, Helmut was gone. He had gone to the hospital to visit his mother, and while there he told her he was worried about the siblings as they hadn't returned home from the beach by the time he had left for the hospital. Back at home, the 4 children told Hans that Marianne and Christine were missing, so Hans took Christine's bag next door and informed her grandparents of the development. It was at about 8:30 p.m. that Jeanette Tegg called the police to inform them that her granddaughter was missing, but she didn't think anything nefarious had happened. When the younger children came home, they brought the girls' train tickets and money with them, so Jeanette assumed the teens were stranded with no way of getting home. Police officers arrived to take the missing persons report at about 11:30 p.m. and were told that the girls had walked north on the beach and never returned. The officers asked about friends or boyfriends, but Helmut said he didn't know anyone in the area they would be with. I couldn't find any information about what the authorities did at the time to locate the missing girls. They may have gone to the beach and the train station to see if Marianne and Christine were stranded, but it doesn't seem like they did. Investigators returned to Brush Road the following morning and asked if either family had heard from the girls, but they hadn't. It's also unclear what the police were doing the first half of the 12th, but at about 2:30 p.m. a call came into the police station in Cronulla that a body had been found on Wanda Beach. The caller was 17-year-old Peter Smith, who had taken his 3 nephews to the beach that day. As the kids were playing in the sand, one of them noticed what he thought was a buried mannequin, but we all know it's never a mannequin. Peter could see some feet sticking out of the sand at one end and part of a head and some hair at the other end. When he bent down to brush some sand from the head, he realized it was the body of a young girl. He rounded up his nephews and went to the Wanda Surf Club to use the telephone and call the police. Once police were on the scene, they started sweeping the sand away from the body, but when they came upon a 3rd foot, they realized there were 2 bodies buried in the sandhill. Once fully uncovered, Marianne was laying on her right side in the fetal position and Christine was laying face down with her head touching Marianne's foot. Marianne had been wearing a black one-piece swimsuit with a sleeveless blouse over the top. The crotch of the swimsuit had been cut and it was pushed up to her chest. Christine had been wearing white shorts and a white and green sleeveless blouse. She wasn't in a swimsuit because she'd been menstruating at the time. Her shorts were pushed up tight onto her body and her sanitary belt and pad were laying on the ground next to her. When the surrounding area was examined, a drag mark about 34 meters or 112 feet went from the bodies to a gully between 2 sand dunes. There were spots of blood along the drag marks. It's believed that Christine had managed to get away during the attack but was caught and dragged back to where they were killed. After a thorough examination of the bodies and surrounding area, Marianne and Christine were removed from the sand and transported to the medical examiner's office. Over the next few days, the sand was sifted through to find any clue as to who murdered the girls, but all they found was a broken piece of knife blade that was later determined to have been possibly part of the murder weapon. The autopsy showed that Christine had a fractured skull, likely having been hit on the head when she attempted to flee. She had multiple stab wounds to her head, back, and neck. The knife had penetrated her liver and both of her lungs. Her cause of death was listed as being from multiple injuries, as it was impossible to determine which one had specifically killed her. The medical examiner determined that sexual assault was attempted, but penetration was unsuccessful. Marianne had also been stabbed multiple times in her arm and back, and her throat had been cut. The knife had penetrated her heart, and the medical examiner believed that was the injury that ended up killing her. It was determined that the attacker had also attempted to sexually assault Marianne but had not penetrated the vagina. Semen was found on the genital area of her body. Christine had a blood alcohol content of 0.015 and there was cabbage and celery in her stomach. It's believed that she may have consumed a beer before her murder and had a Chico roll as a snack. Marianne had no food or alcohol in her system. Despite the poor weather, there was quite a few people at the beach on January 11th. One man came forward saying he had seen 2 teen girls on horseback that day, as well as 2 teen girls walking north along the sandhills. He also saw a male who looked to be about 19 years old with light-colored hair and khaki shorts and a white t-shirt walking near the area where the bodies were found. The description of the clothing the girls he saw walking were wearing matched Marianne and Christine. As he got to the Wanda Surf Club, he saw an older man, 40s to 50s, with a short, stocky build walking north. The 2 girls on horseback were Louise Coffey and Julene Williams, both 15. They had seen a man who they described as being in his 30s, also stocky with brown hair. When they came back up the beach, they noticed the man was still standing there, but when Julene looked back after they passed him, he was gone. At about the same time Marianne and Christine left the siblings and started walking north, 2 other young horse riders, Janine Layson and Judy Blackwell, had stopped about 260 meters or 1,200 feet north of the murder site, where they were startled when a fully nude man appeared from behind a sandhill and started walking south. He was holding a wad of clothing in his hand, and Janine shouted at the man, but his response was muffled by the strong wind and he disappeared. An older gentleman was walking on the beach for exercise, and he said he saw 2 young girls matching the description of Marianne and Christine, and shortly after he saw 2 young men in their 20s walk toward them. It wasn't until the Schmidt siblings were interviewed on the 12th that Wolfgang told the investigators that his sister and her friend were walking with a blonde-haired surfie. Despite all the other witness statements, authorities seemed to put their effort into finding the young man that Wolfgang had described. They came up with a theory that Marianne and Christine had made a plan to meet a boy they already knew at the beach and that he was the killer. In an effort to prove their theory, police investigated further into the idea that the girls had met someone they knew at the beach. At the Schmidt house, they were given 2 letters written by Marianne to a boy she seemed to have romantic feelings for. Otherwise, nobody in the house knew of any plans they had to meet anyone at the beach. When investigators went next door, Christine's grandmother also hadn't heard of any plans to meet up with a boy during their time out. There had been rumors that Marianne and Christine were seen talking to a young man on one of the trains, but when interviewed, all of the siblings who were with them said they did not talk to anyone. They also said they didn't hear either of them talk about meeting someone, which you'd think a couple of teen girls would have a hard time keeping a complete secret during the hours they were together before they disappeared. The investigators were failing to find a reasonable suspect to match their theory, but a few days into the investigation, Trixie told a detective that she had seen a teen boy walking along the beach carrying a knife and hunting for crabs. When she described the boy, Wolfgang said it was the same one he had seen walking with the girls later when he went out looking for them. The investigators adjusted their theory to be that the girls befriended a boy on the beach and he attacked and murdered them. They put out a message in the media looking for the boy that was searching for crabs on the beach on January 11th, but nobody ever came forward. A stowaway was discovered on a freighter bound from England that left Sydney just days after the murders, but the man was eventually cleared. A shirtless man who had been at the rail station in Cronulla was questioned and cleared. An 18-year-old who was vacationing at the Wanda Surf Club arrived the afternoon of the murders, but he was also not involved. Police interviewed about 7,000 people, and it became the largest investigation in Australian history. Still, the case went cold. I'm sure Marianne's siblings were trying to help, but at such young ages, their recounting of events, with the details changing slightly each time, only made the investigators unsure of what was fact. More confusion would be added to the case as 5 different men would confess to the crime over time. All of them were confirmed to have had nothing to do with the murders through confirmed whereabouts and their lack of knowledge of how the murders were committed. Unfortunately, sometimes mental illness will cause someone to confess to a crime they didn't commit, or someone already caught committing another crime will confess to a famous unsolved crime in order to gain more notoriety. It generally just makes the case harder to solve by wasting time and resources confirming that the person isn't guilty. In 1975, convicted rapist and murderer Alan Bassett painted a picture that one detective believed was of the Wanda Beach murders. I couldn't find a picture of the painting, but the detective believed it showed drag marks in sand, blood trails, and a broken knife blade. He also believed there were too many similarities between the murders of Marianne and Christine and the case of Carolyn Orphan, who Allen had raped and murdered on June 11, 1966. The detective repeatedly visited Allen Bassett in prison, asking him if he was ready to confess, but the convict always denied any involvement. That detective was planning to write a book about his theory when he died in the 80s. That line of investigation was not continued, as many others in law enforcement didn't share the same opinions about the theory. Allen Bassett was released on parole in 1995 and continued to regularly check in with his parole officer and denied being involved in any other crimes than the one he was convicted of. He did publicly offer to provide a DNA sample, but authorities have refused to say whether or not that ever happened. The two most commonly named suspects have both been covered here in other full episodes. Christopher Wilder is mostly known as a serial killer in the U.S. who went on a 40-day crime spree across the country before being shot and killed by police in 1984. But that was only the end of a long career of sexual assault. Christopher was born in Australia, and when he was convicted of rape in 1962, he was only 17. He was known to regularly go to the beach, convince young women that he was a photographer, and then take photos that he could then use against them. He was questioned about another rape in 1969, but fled to the U.S. where he continued posing as a photographer in order to lure girls where he could sexually assault them. He returned to Australia in 1982 to visit family, and over the 2 weeks he was there, multiple women reported him for kidnapping and assault, and he was arrested. While awaiting trial, he was allowed to return to the U.S. with a promise he would return for court, but he didn't. He was killed a few years later. His MO matched, and he matched the physical description of the boy Wolfgang had described walking with Marianne and Christine at the beach. Some people point out that Christopher had not killed anybody in Australia, and his first murder wasn't until 17 years later, after he had fled Australia the second time. If you want to know more about the case of Christopher Wilder, you can watch or listen to the episode I did about it. A link is in the description. The other common suspect is Derek Percy, who is believed to have murdered a number of children in the mid to late 60s. He was eventually found not guilty by reason of insanity for the murder of Yvonne Toohey in 1969 and sent to a mental health facility for the remainder of his life. Based on his own story and where he had been in 1965 and his MO of sexually assaulting and murdering children, he is listed as a possibility, though there isn't anything substantial linking him to the murders. He was also alive long enough to do a DNA comparison, but authorities have stated that DNA has not impacted the case. So I have a feeling the semen collected at the scene was either not enough or possibly degraded over time. It's very likely that the sample from 1965 did not get stored properly. If you want to know more about the case of Derek Percy, you can watch or listen to the episode I did about him. A link is in the description. With as much time that has passed, it's unlikely that the Wanda Beach murders will ever be solved. Witnesses have died and evidence is likely unavailable. The two most common suspects have died, and the chance that some new information will pop up to point to the killer is unlikely. Unfortunately, the world will probably never know who really killed Marianne Schmidt and Christine Sharrock. Thanks for watching This Is Monsters. New episodes are uploaded twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays. There are occasional bonus episodes covering unsolved cases and criminal history. If you have a suggestion for a case you think I should cover, leave it in the comments. You can always follow the channel on Instagram at thisis_monsters and purchase merch at thisismonsters.com. Thanks so much, and be safe.